Welcome back. You're watching Indus News live from our studios in Lahore. I'm Usman Lone. Well, we start from the United States, which has announced the deployment of more than 1,000 more troops to the Middle East. It's come amid rising tensions with Iran. And this comes after Tehran said it will break its uranium stockpile limit agreed upon under the 2015 nuclear deal within 10 days. New deployment is in addition to 100 more troop increase announced by the US last month. Acting US Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan said the deployment is in response to Iranian forces' hostile intentions. Shanahan said Iran's attacks on the oil tankers confirm its hostile intentions and that threatens US interests in the region. The US said that Tehran's plan to enhance its stock of low-enriched uranium must be met with increased international pressure. Meanwhile, Iran says there's still time for European powers to save the 2015 nuclear deal. Tehran called on European signatories of the deal to back the pledges with action. Well, the EU says it will consider Iran in compliance with the 2015 nuclear deal unless a breach is proven. The European Union said keeping the Iran nuclear deal alive was not easy. EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini issued the statement after a meeting of the bloc's Foreign Affairs Council. She quoted technical reports of the International Atomic Energy Agency on the Iran nuclear deal. Mogherini remained tight-lipped about the EU's potential response to Iran's threatened uranium stockpiling.
Our assessment on the implementation of the agreement is based on the factual, technically sound assessment and evaluation that the IAEA makes in its reports. And so far, Iran has been compliant with its nuclear commitments.
Well, France has also stepped in with French President Emmanuel Macron urging more dialogue with Iran, but regretted Tehran's approachment on uranium enrichment. Macron was addressing a news conference with his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky. More in this report.
The French president says he's uneasy with Iran's announcement, but Paris will hold talks with Tehran and its partners to avoid increasing tensions in the region. He says France will encourage Iran to be patient, adding there's still time for more dialogue.
I regret, of course, the Iranian announcement made today, but as the International Atomic Energy Agency has underlined, Iran is respecting its commitments and we strongly encourage it to continue its patient and responsible behavior.
Ukraine's President Zelensky demanded the release of 24 Ukrainian sailors detained in Russia. The Russian Navy captured the sailors and their 3 ships in November last year after opening fire on them. The Kremlin has ignored calls for their release.
I am very grateful to President Macron for the concern that he has regarding for the future of Ukrainian prisoners. They all have to be released immediately. Russia has to follow the decisions of international courts and allow the 24 Ukrainian sailors to go home.
Iran is increasing its enrichment of low-grade uranium and will pass the permitted stockpile under the nuclear deal in 10 days. An Iranian Atomic Energy Agency spokesman made the announcement on Monday.
Well, Iran says Saudi Arabia is fueling crisis in the region by resorting to force. Foreign Ministry spokesman Abbas Mousavi says Riyadh lacks an understanding of the region's dynamics. Both sides have been locked in a war of words after attacks on 2 oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman. The United States and Saudi Arabia blame Iran for the assaults, which the country denies. President Donald Trump says starting next week, US authorities will begin removing millions of illegal immigrants. Some 12 million immigrants, mainly from Mexico and Central America, live in the US illegally. Trump says the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, also known as ICE, will remove migrants as fast as they come in. The US has also announced it will permanently cut hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to El Salvador, Guatemala and Honduras. Trump has threatened to do so in March, asking the Central American countries to stop illegal immigration to the US. Now, at least 12 people have died after a 6.0 magnitude earthquake shook China's southwestern Sichuan province. Over 130 others have been injured. 9 people died in Changning County and 3 others in Sichuan. The quake was followed by 4 aftershocks, the strongest one of 5.1 magnitude. Over 4,000 people were relocated as dozens of structures collapsed. Earthquakes regularly strike Sichuan, which a powerful 7.9 magnitude earthquake left over 80,000 people dead in 2008. In the UK, 6 leadership hopefuls will face a second vote in the race to replace Theresa May as Prime Minister. Candidates who come last or fail to secure at least 33 votes will be eliminated from the contest. Conservative MPs will vote by a secret ballot in the House of Commons, with a result expected later today. Survivors of today's vote will go on to take part in a live debate. Further ballots later in the week will whittle down the candidates to a final 2. Beginning on June 22nd, the final names will be put to a postal vote of 160,000 Tory members. Currently, Boris Johnson remains the clear front-runner in the race after topping the first ballot with 114 votes. In New Zealand, a court has sentenced the man accused of distributing the Christchurch mosque terror attacks video to 21 months in prison. Philip Arps pleaded guilty to 2 charges of distributing the footage that was then live-streamed on social media. Arps was arrested in Christchurch 4 days after alleged gunman Brenton Tarrant's March 15th terror attack at the 2 mosques. He described the video as awesome and showed no empathy towards victims. Christchurch district judge ruled his actions as a hate crime against the Muslim community. Tarrant's attack killed 51 Muslim worshippers. New Zealand has also tightened its gun laws to ban semi-automatic weapons since the terror attack. Russia has warned that alleged American hacking into Russia's electric power grid could escalate into a cyber war. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov claimed that US President Donald Trump was not informed about the attack. The Kremlin said it was confident in Russia's ability to repel electronic breaches and attacks. As the crisis continues in Sudan, its protest leaders have called for nighttime demonstrations and marches in the capital Khartoum and elsewhere in the country. The standoff has intensified between the ruling military council and civilians over a future leadership of a governing body. Most roads in Khartoum are blocked by barricades set up by activists angered by the June 3rd Khartoum massacre. Meanwhile, fake charity accounts on social media are taking advantage of Sudan's crisis in a bid to potentially solicit money and followers. Several accounts on social media lie about donating meals to people in Sudan. A few, however, have been able to prove their pledges. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says Moscow is working to promote negotiations on the Korean peninsula. Lavrov's South Korean counterpart Kang Kyung-hwa says US and North Korea should resume their nuclear talks. The ministers were speaking at a news conference after talks in Moscow in April. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un visited the Russian city of Vladivostok to meet President Vladimir Putin. China's President Xi Jinping will visit North Korea this week as Beijing improves relations with Pyongyang amid tensions with the United States. His visit will mark the first trip by a Chinese president to the North in 14 years. Xi Jinping is visiting Pyongyang on the invitation of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The visit is a week ahead of the G20 summit in Japan, where US President Donald Trump is expected to meet his Chinese counterpart. South Korea says President Xi's visit will help the early resumption of nuclear negotiations on the Korean peninsula. At least 12 people have been killed as their migrant boat sank off Turkey's western coast. The Coast Guard says 31 others have been rescued. The search and rescue operation launched by the Guard is still underway. The boat was carrying over 40 migrants. Turkey has become one of the main launch points for migrants taking the sea route to the EU. Former Egyptian President Mohamed Morsy is dead at the age of 67. State media says Morsy fainted after a court session and died soon after. He was a leading figure in the Muslim Brotherhood but was toppled by the military in 2013. After mass protests against his rule, he was serving a 7-year sentence for faking his nomination papers in the 2012 presidential race. Well, do stay with us as we'll be back after this short break. Welcome back to Indus News. Well, thousands of Indian doctors are on strike, calling for protection against violence by patients and their families. The protest began when 3 doctors were attacked in the eastern state of West Bengal. More in this report.
In India, the suffering of patients have augmented due to the non-availability of medical assistance to them. Outdoor patients remained unattended as doctors refused to resume work until the fulfillment of their demands. The Indian Medical Association called for tougher punishments for those assaulting the hospital staff. Doctors are providing their services at hospitals' emergency and casualty departments. Young doctors said they were giving maximum output despite poor working conditions.
We want to serve you to the best of our abilities. We are trying to give you the best of our care what we can. But there are other compounded issues along with it, which is sort of lack of infrastructure, lack of doctor is to patient ratio. All these things are other factors which come into play. Despite all these grievances, we try to give the best we can.
The patients said that they went through trouble due to the protest.
I've come for medicine. They said doctors are on strike. I underwent a lot of trouble. My medicine got over and I had to come from very far. The incident happened in West Bengal. Karnataka people are not involved in the incident. Why are common people troubled like this?
The Chief Minister of West Bengal met protesting doctors and asked them to resume work. India spends less than 2% of its GDP on healthcare, making it one of the lowest investors in the sector globally.
Pakistan's JF17 Thunder combat aircraft has performed impressively in the 53rd Paris Air Show. France's President Emmanuel Macron inaugurated the event. Pakistan's ambassador to France, Moin ul-Haq, and senior officials of the Pakistani Armed Forces attended the air show. The ambassador praised the strong representation of the Pakistan Air Force and the Pakistan Navy at the Paris Air Show. The Pakistan Air Force is showing the JF17 Thunder aircraft in aerial and static display, while the Pakistan Navy is exhibiting its ATR reconnaissance aircraft. Now, staying with Pakistan, and they said they will cooperate with the UK and continue their collaboration between law enforcement agencies. The commitment came as Pakistani Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi met British Home Secretary Sajid Javid in London. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi and British Home Secretary Sajid Javid restated their promise to end money laundering. Both ministers underlined the need for cooperation in returning stolen financial assets. Immigration and visas were also on the meeting's agenda. FM Qureshi is in the UK for the 4th review of the Pakistan-UK Enhanced Strategic Dialogue. Now, the Pakistan FM also spoke to US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. They've discussed the Afghan peace process. In a telephone conversation, Qureshi and Pompeo exchanged views on regional security and bilateral ties. Qureshi also apprised Pompeo of Pakistan's counter-terrorism efforts. In Syria, at least 12 people have been killed in a rebel rocket attack in the country's northwest. War monitors say 5 children are among the dead. At least 15 others have been wounded in a similar attack to the south of Aleppo. This is 2 days after 34 people died in fighting between government forces and rebel fighters in Idlib. The clashes in the country's northwestern provinces have claimed over 360 lives since late April. The United Nations says the fighting has displaced nearly 300,000 people. Now, illegal sand extraction are destroying beaches and threatening Morocco's coastline. The lucrative venture is sucking up billions of tons of sand from beaches, rivers and the ocean floor. More in this report.
Beaches around the world are disappearing. They are heavily exploited across the planet, both legally and illegally. In Morocco, sand mafias pose a great threat to the river deltas and coastlines. The country's beaches are shrinking, resulting in coastal erosion.
Today, more than 32 million cubic meters of fine sand are consumed. What is reported is less than 16 million cubic meters. That means that 16 million cubic meters have unknown sources.
Sand is the world's second most consumed resource after water. Legal and illegal sand miners are competing in the race to provide sand for use in the construction industry. The UN Environment Programme's report warns that it will destroy the main natural attraction for visitors.
The mafia is stealing the natural heritage of the entire country. It has cost the country years of development, as all the sand on the beaches is stolen day and night with the help of some politicians.
Theft of sand from beaches or coastal dunes in Morocco is punishable by 5 years in prison. To fight this uncontrolled illegal business, Morocco is contriving a national coastal protection plan.
UN Climate Chief Patricia Espinosa opened the Bonn Climate Change Conference today. She says the world needs to limit the increase of global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The 10-day Bonn Climate Change Conference will include meetings on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. UN Climate Chief Patricia Espinosa warns time to fight global warming is running out. She also applauded Greta Thunberg and other young climate activists.
It is time that all people open their eyes to just how urgent things are. There is no time to waste. We need to get to the 1.5 degree goal, and we need to create the tools and instruments that will allow all countries around the world, and not only governments, but also all stakeholders, to have the capacity to do that deep transformation that is required.
Now, a Japanese town is striving to make a difference. Kamikatsu, a small community in southwestern Shikoku Island, plans to have zero waste by 2022. More in this report.
Plastic, paper, metal. In the Japanese town of Kamikatsu, sorting rubbish isn't that simple. Residents face a mind-boggling 45 categories to sort their garbage as the town aims to be zero waste by 2020.
We now have more than 40 categories, and I confess that I am a bit lost. So what I'm doing is I'm clumsily separating the glass, cans, paper, magazines, and I bring it to the center where I receive the sorting.
Efforts to cut back waste began in 2002 when the town had to shut down one of its incinerators. It no longer met strict emission standards. Instead, residents decided to recycle their waste.
Before to do this job, I used to buy new if it didn't work anymore or if it was damaged, but my philosophy changed considerably.
Kamikatsu and its 1,500 residents are already close to their goal, recycling 80% of its waste. They say it would be difficult for a bigger town to do the same. Unfortunately, there has been little reduction in consumption.
I think the consumers can reduce the consumption up to a certain point, but it also depends on the producers to produce less. Otherwise, it won't solve the issue.
Japan has introduced a plan to reduce plastic waste by a quarter by 2030, but it won't come into effect before 2020 and time is running out.
Now in business news, Airbus has launched its longest range narrow-body airliner at the Paris Air Show. It's called the A321XLR, and it's the long version of Airbus's best-selling A321neo jet. The jet is Airbus's response to the need for even more range and fuel efficiency. The European plane maker is expecting 200 orders for the new model. The leasing company Air Lease Corporation has announced a deal for 100 planes, including 27 of the new A321XLR jets. The new Airbus plane steals a march on rivals Boeing's plans for a possible new mid-market jet.
The A321XLR, ladies and gentlemen, it is an aircraft capable of 4,700 nautical miles of range in a typical longer range configuration. That would be two-class configuration. It is therefore, by definition, for ranges like this, the lowest risk investment deployment for an airline opening new routes in that sector range.
In the FIFA Women's World Cup, Norway and France win their latest round of matches. Norway knocked out South Korea by 2-1, while the host France bagged a 1-0 victory over Nigeria. Norway have now reached the last 16 of the World Cup after eliminating South Korea by scoring penalties in each half of the match. Midfielder Caroline Hansen took the lead after scoring the opening goal in the 5th minute. And Isabel Herlofsen scored the second penalty early on in the second half of the match. South Korea's Yeo Min-yi turned in the late consolation from a close-range finish. The victory has clinched second spot in Group A for Norway. Earlier, France defeated Nigeria by 1-0 in the last game of their group stage matches. Wendy Renard scored a late penalty to move France on the top spot of the group. Well, it's nice and sunny here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. Well, that's all for now, but do stay tuned for further updates on Indus News.